Most car manufacturers begin with a simple question: how can we make our next sports car faster, more comfortable, and easier to live with? Porsche asked a completely different question. How much of a real race car can we legally put on public roads before governments tell us to stop? The answer became the Porsche 911 GT3 RS, Generation 992. At first glance, it looks almost unbelievable. Massive air intakes consume the entire front bumper. Louvers cut through the front fenders. The rear wing is taller than the roof itself and equipped with a Formula One-inspired drag reduction system. Every surface appears designed by aerodynamics rather than stylists. It almost seems impossible that this machine carries a license plate instead of a racing number. And yet, despite looking like a purpose-built GT race car, the GT3 RS is fully street legal. Personally, I think that's what makes this car so extraordinary. Porsche didn't build a road car inspired by racing. They built a race car and somehow convinced regulators to let people drive it to work. To understand why the GT3 RS exists, we have to go back more than 2 decades. Since the birth of the original GT3 in 1999, Porsche Motorsport has followed one philosophy above everything else: every generation must become closer to the race car than the one before it. While most manufacturers chased larger engines, hybrid systems, and ever-increasing horsepower figures, Porsche engineers focused on something far more difficult to achieve: efficiency. They obsessed over weight distribution, suspension geometry, cooling, airflow, steering precision, tire contact patches, and driver confidence. They understood a simple truth that many companies still ignore today. A faster engine doesn't automatically create a faster car. The stopwatch only cares about lap time. By the time development of the 992 GT3 RS began, Porsche's engineers were no longer asking how to improve the previous model. They were asking how to transfer as much knowledge as possible from endurance racing directly into a production automobile. Lessons learned through countless hours competing in GT3 and GTE championships around the world found their way into every component of the new car. Nothing escaped scrutiny. The suspension was redesigned with double wishbones at the front, directly inspired by the 911 RSR race car. Cooling systems were completely reorganized, replacing the traditional 3-radiator layout with one enormous central radiator to maximize airflow efficiency. The underbody became an active aerodynamic tool rather than simply a protective cover. Even the smallest vents, ducts, and openings existed because engineers could prove they reduced lap times. There wasn't a single decorative feature anywhere on the car. Every line had a measurable purpose. Perhaps the most remarkable decision, however, involved the engine. At a time when almost every manufacturer relied on turbochargers or hybrid assistants to increase performance, Porsche deliberately refused to follow the trend. Instead, the GT3 RS retained a naturally aspirated 4.0-liter flat-six producing around 518 horsepower and screaming all the way to an astonishing 9,000 revolutions per minute. On paper, competitors offered significantly more power. Some exceeded 700 horsepower. Others approached 4 figures. But Porsche understood something many people forget. Horsepower wins arguments. Balance wins races. The naturally aspirated engine delivered instant throttle response, extraordinary precision, and a level of communication that simply cannot be replicated by forced induction. Every movement of the driver's right foot produced an immediate reaction, creating an almost telepathic connection between human and machine. Then came perhaps the most controversial feature of all: the rear wing. It wasn't simply enormous, it was functional in ways never before seen on a production 911. Equipped with an active drag reduction system similar in principle to Formula One, the wing could reduce aerodynamic drag on straights before instantly returning to maximum downforce during braking and cornering. Combined with active front aerodynamic elements, the GT3 RS generated more than 850 kilograms of downforce at approximately 285 kilometers per hour, figures once reserved for dedicated racing prototypes. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't a Le Mans car. It wasn't a GT3 race machine. It was a production automobile you could legally register, insure, and drive home from the dealership. That's almost absurd. And perhaps that's exactly why the GT3 RS has become one of the most respected performance cars of the modern era. It doesn't chase luxury. It doesn't chase comfort. It doesn't even chase horsepower. It chases one thing, and one thing only: lap time. Every decision, every gram of weight, every aerodynamic surface, every suspension component, and every mechanical system exists for a single purpose: making the driver faster. And once you understand that philosophy, you begin to realize the GT3 RS isn't trying to compete with other supercars at all. It's trying to redefine what a road-legal sports car is capable of becoming. When the covers finally came off the 992 GT3 RS, the automotive world reacted with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. Even people who had followed Porsche for decades couldn't believe what they were seeing. This wasn't simply another evolution of the GT3 formula. It looked like a Le Mans race car that had somehow escaped the paddock and driven straight onto public roads. Journalists immediately noticed something unusual. Porsche barely talked about horsepower during the presentation. There were no dramatic claims about building the most powerful 911 ever made. Instead, engineers spent hours discussing airflow, cooling efficiency, suspension kinematics, tire loading, and aerodynamic balance. That alone revealed everything about the philosophy behind the car. While the rest of the industry continued chasing bigger numbers for marketing brochures, Porsche focused on something customers couldn't brag about at a coffee shop, but something every racing driver understands immediately: consistency, predictability, confidence. Personally, I think that's the biggest reason Porsche remains so successful in motorsport. They don't build cars to impress people standing next to them. They build cars to impress stopwatches. And the stopwatch never lies. One of the most revolutionary aspects of the GT3 RS was something almost invisible to casual observers. Every aerodynamic component worked together as part of one complete system rather than functioning independently. Air entered through the enormous central radiator, traveled through carefully engineered channels, accelerated beneath the flat underbody, exited through the hood vents, and continued toward the rear wing without creating unnecessary turbulence. Even the front suspension received teardrop-shaped control arms designed specifically to generate additional downforce. Imagine the level of obsession required for suspension components to become aerodynamic devices. That's no longer automotive engineering. That's aerospace engineering applied to a road car. Then came the active aerodynamics. For decades, road cars had used adjustable spoilers, but never with this level of sophistication. Using controls mounted directly on the steering wheel, the driver could activate drag reduction system on long straights, flattening the rear wing to reduce drag and increase top speed. Seconds later, during heavy braking, the wing instantly rotated into a near-vertical position, acting as an enormous air brake while simultaneously increasing rear downforce. Watching the system operate almost felt surreal. It looked less like a sports car and more like modern Formula One technology translated into something carrying license plates. Porsche engineers later admitted that software development had become just as important as mechanical engineering. Hundreds of sensors constantly monitored vehicle speed, steering angle, throttle position, brake pressure, suspension movement, and countless other variables to ensure every aerodynamic adjustment happened at precisely the right moment. Yet despite all this technology, the car never felt artificial. Everything happened so naturally that drivers often described it as an extension of their own instincts rather than a computer making decisions for them. The suspension represented another enormous leap forward. Borrowing directly from the 911 RSR endurance racer, Porsche introduced double wishbone front suspension, a configuration almost universally used in professional motorsport because it maintains far better tire contact during aggressive cornering. Combined with fully adjustable dampers and separate compression and rebound settings controlled from the cockpit, the GT3 RS allowed drivers to fine-tune the chassis for different circuits without touching a single wrench. Think about that for a moment. Most production cars offer comfort, sport, or track modes selected with a button. The GT3 RS lets you adjust the behavior of the suspension almost like a race engineer preparing for qualifying. That's an entirely different level of driver involvement. And then there was the engine. In an era dominated by turbocharging and hybrid assistance, Porsche remained stubbornly loyal to natural aspiration. Many questioned that decision. Why settle for just over 500 horsepower when competitors offered 7 or even 800? But the answer became obvious the moment drivers left pit lane. The naturally aspirated flat-six responded instantly to every throttle input, climbed effortlessly toward its 9,000 revolutions per minute redline, and delivered a soundtrack that no turbocharged engine could replicate. There was no waiting for boost. No artificial enhancement. Only mechanical precision. Every gear change through the lightning-fast 7-speed PDK transmission felt perfectly synchronized with the engine's relentless hunger for revs. It wasn't simply fast, it was alive. Perhaps that's why so many professional racing drivers fell in love with the GT3 RS almost immediately. They understood that ultimate performance isn't created by horsepower alone. It's created when every system works together so seamlessly that the driver stops thinking about the car entirely and begins focusing only on the road ahead. Early independent tests confirmed exactly what Porsche had been promising throughout development. Around legendary circuits such as the Nürburgring Nordschleife, the the GT3 RS began producing lap times that seemed almost impossible for a naturally aspirated road car. It challenged and often surpassed machines carrying hundreds more horsepower, exotic carbon fiber monocoques, hybrid drivetrains, and price tags approaching or exceeding $1 million. Suddenly, the conversation changed. The question was no longer whether the GT3 RS was the best version of the 911. People started asking something much bigger. Had Porsche quietly built the greatest driver's car of the modern era? Even the tuning world approached the GT3 RS differently from most supercars. Companies like Manthey Racing, TechArt, and Akrapovic understood that there was little reason to chase enormous power gains. Instead, they refined aerodynamics, reduced weight, optimized suspension geometry, and enhanced braking performance, the same philosophy Porsche itself had followed from the beginning. That says everything about the platform. When the world's best tuners spend more time improving airflow than increasing horsepower, you know the engineers got almost everything right the first time. By that point, it had become obvious that the GT3 RS wasn't trying to win spec sheet comparisons. It was proving something far more important, that decades of relentless engineering refinement could still outperform brute force. And in doing so, Porsche once again reminded the automotive world that true performance has never been about chasing the biggest number. It's about creating the perfect balance between machine and driver. The Porsche 911 GT3 RS is often described as the ultimate expression of the 911, but I think that definition doesn't go far enough. In many ways, it feels like the final chapter of an engineering philosophy that is slowly disappearing from the automotive world. Look around today's performance car market. Hybrid systems are becoming the new standard. Turbocharged engines dominate almost every segment. Electric assistance delivers instant torque, sophisticated computers correct nearly every mistake, and software increasingly determines how a car behaves. None of those technologies are inherently bad, they've made modern performance cars faster than ever before. But they have also changed the relationship between driver and machine. The GT3 RS refuses to follow that path. Every kilometer reminds you that this car was designed for people who want to feel everything. The steering doesn't filter information, it delivers it. The suspension doesn't isolate the road, it explains it. The naturally aspirated engine doesn't overwhelm you with torque, it rewards precision, patience, and commitment. To extract everything from the GT3 RS, you have to earn it. Personally, I think that's becoming incredibly rare. Modern supercars often make extraordinary performance feel effortless. The GT3 RS still asks something from the driver. It demands concentration, smoothness, and trust. And because of that, every perfect corner feels genuinely satisfying. It never creates the illusion that anyone can drive like a professional racing driver. Instead, it encourages you to become a better driver yourself. That's a completely different philosophy from almost everything else on sale today. One of the most remarkable achievements of the GT3 RS is that it manages to combine two worlds that normally cannot exist together. On one hand, it's capable of circulating the Nürburgring at a pace that embarrasses machines costing 2 or 3 times as much. On the other, you can legally drive it home afterward with the air conditioning running, your favorite music playing through the speakers, and a license plate still attached to the bumper. That dual personality has always been one of Porsche's greatest strengths, but the 992 GT3 RS pushes it further than any previous generation. It's no coincidence that racing teams, professional instructors, and experienced track day enthusiasts speak about this car with almost universal admiration. They understand something that isn't obvious from a specification sheet. Building a fast car is difficult. Building a car that remains predictable at the limit is far more difficult. The GT3 RS inspires confidence rather than fear. Lap after lap, it communicates exactly how much grip remains available, allowing drivers to approach the limit with extraordinary precision. That's why so many people describe it as one of the most approachable race-inspired cars ever built. Not because it's easy, but because it's honest. The tuning community reached a similar conclusion. Unlike many high-performance cars that immediately receive massive turbo upgrades and huge horsepower increases, the GT3 RS is usually treated with remarkable respect. Manthey Racing focused on refining aerodynamics and chassis setup. Akrapovic developed lighter exhaust systems that enhanced the engine's natural voice without changing its character. Other specialists concentrated on reducing weight, improving cooling efficiency, and optimizing suspension geometry rather than chasing unrealistic power figures. That says everything about the original engineering. When experts decide the smartest modification is to preserve the balance rather than reinvent it, you know the factory got the formula almost perfectly right. Looking toward the future, many enthusiasts have begun asking an uncomfortable question. Will Porsche ever build another car quite like this? As emissions regulations become stricter around the world and electrification continues transforming the automotive industry, naturally aspirated high-revving engines are becoming increasingly difficult to justify. Cars like the GT3 RS aren't disappearing because engineers no longer know how to build them. They're disappearing because the world around them is changing. That's what gives the 992 GT3 RS an importance beyond its incredible performance. It isn't simply another generation of the 911. It represents the culmination of more than 60 years of continuous engineering refinement. Every lesson learned from motorsport, every victory at Le Mans, every lap completed on the Nürburgring, every GT3 and every RS model that came before, it all comes together here. The GT3 RS doesn't feel like a revolution. It feels like perfection through evolution. And perhaps that's the greatest compliment any engineer could ever receive. Not that they invented something completely new, but that after decades of relentless improvement, they finally reached a point where almost nothing remained to improve. That's why the Porsche 911 GT3 RS isn't remembered simply as one of the fastest 911s ever built. It's remembered as the moment Porsche demonstrated that true greatness isn't achieved by chasing trends. It's achieved by relentlessly perfecting an idea that the rest of the world once believed was impossible.